but yeah, so uh, it's really something to be able to stand in the spot where something like this happened and just kind of try and project yourself back into time and imagine what it must have been like, and and it's really something to do it in American Samoa, and if nothing else, I'll always be grateful to this project for giving me the opportunity and the excuse to come down and discover that for myself, because it is just a beautiful island and well, group of islands, really. I've only had the fortune of in American Samoa to visit Tutuila, but but even that time there was really eye-opening, and I had rented a car to drive myself around, and so I'd explored in the harbor area and up to hiked to the top of Mount Alava, and then tried to drive out to Tapu Tapu Point. It took some doing because I was pulling over every few half mile or so just to take pictures because it was so stunning, and they've done a lot to preserve a lot of the island is has been given over to national park, and is just stunning. And as I understand, the islands out further to the east are also you know uh, preserved, and there's an immense um, ocean national marine sanctuary in American Samoa, offshore, that is one of the largest in the entire system, if not the largest. Um, but yeah, so it is really a wonderful thing to be able to come here, and I definitely want to say, you mentioned that we have people on the streaming, viewing the streaming from American Samoa, and to them we want to say talofa, or hello, and maybe give them a task, and spread the word, because one of the things that we discovered in our research was that um, the the accident report and some of the radiograms and so forth and the newspaper articles all mention an eyewitness, uh, and nobody gives her name. She's just the woman, or the witness, and they describe her as she was in a boat, making her way from Fangasa to Asu, and I hope I'm pronouncing those right. But Fangasa is a bay on the northern side of the island, on the other, basically the opposite side from Pongo Pongo, and she was making her way to Asu, which is west down the coast, and kind of it's unclear whether she was just traveling to see family, or was she fishing, and or how far offshore she was. Um, but she gives a very vivid description of what happened, and one that was deemed extremely reliable because she related the story before word had reached them that the plane was missing. Um, and again, like, we're never given her name, and I just have to wonder. I will have to wonder who was she, and does that story still survive? I mean, I would think an experience like that would be one that you would share with your family, and they would pass that down from generation to generation, and maybe people within living in the same area would have heard it as well. Maybe her neighbors heard that story. So if you're listening, please, like, ask around, ask your relatives, ask your parents or your uncles or aunts, or maybe you remember hearing these stories yourself, or who knows, maybe she's still out there somewhere. But please, uh, you know join the search. Help us investigate this, and peel back yet another layer, and, like, let's give her due as well. I want to know who this person was. So
Right, and this eyewitness statement, I mean, it played such a crucial role in the accident report, even in determining where the aircraft was last seen and helping to sort of map and determine, where to send investigators later on.
Yeah, yeah, and also in trying to deduce, what had happened to the airplane, and it's interesting. It's very vivid, the description and how, she says that the plane flew low overhead and was headed in the direction of Apia, which is west, and then as it was passing over, she described it as trailing smoke. But then after it had passed, she caught the smell of gasoline, and we know that they were engaged in dumping fuel. So the supposition is that actually what she interpreted as smoke may have been actually fuel vapor, like the atomized like fuel vapor trailing behind the airplane, and then logically she would have smelled the gasoline in the air as it went by, and then she sees it turn out to sea, and then it dives very suddenly for the water, and then pulls out and appears to land. And just over the surface of the water, there's a flash and the sound like a gunshot, and then smoke, and the wings of the plane floating at the surface for an appreciable interval, and then about 5 minutes, and then sinking from sight. And that seems to dovetail pretty well with the type, with the evidence that they collected at the scene, where um, they only found very small pieces of the aircraft, or items known to have been on board. It's described as bits of flooring and the partitioning, on the walls, and pages from navigational texts, and the navigator's drift target tray, with a piece of flooring actually kind of blasted into it, and then really most heartbreaking of all, a tattered Pan American officer's jacket with the winged logo still affixed, that they determined belonged to the radio operator, Tom Findlay. And also apparently a pair of trousers with a bent tie clasp in the pocket that they believed belonged to Jack Brooks, the assistant engineer. Um, and yeah, so the nature of those items, that they were relatively small and seemed to be confined to a particular area of the plane. Those two compartments where the fuel and the navigator station, and then well, the drift tray was maybe in the cabin just adjacent to the fuel tanks, but so the damage, the detonation was there underneath, and then in compartment D, in the where the hull tanks were, and that the feeling, just from looking at those pieces, that the airplane was damaged in those sections, but that the rest of it, presumably held together in a relatively tight concentration, and sank from sight, and that jives with the account that the witness gave. So a lot of the pieces come together, and one other thing, that the newspaper reports talk about a great quantity of aluminum powder was found floating on the surface, and as it turns out, the the navigators drift, what they call drift bombs, or sometimes referred to as drift targets, was this really, well, there's no way to describe it. It looks like a bomb. It's this small, kind of like Nerf football sized item with fins on the back, and uh, and glass kind of construction filled with aluminum powder. And the idea was that the navigator would go to the back of the plane, and he would drop one of these in flight, and then it would impact the ocean and spread this powder, and then he could he had a good target that he could watch and estimate what effect the wind was having on the airplane as it moved through the air. So are they drifting off course? Because the hand of the wind is invisible, to the pilot, and especially when you're flying over kind of trackless ocean, there's no landmarks to judge, how your relative motion. So if the wind is hitting you from the side and pushing you, but the airplane is still pointed in the direction you want to go, you don't know that how much of an effect that's having. So you make this mark on the ocean surface with this aluminum powder, and then that allows you to track your relative motion. And amazingly, one of these items is an example of one of these is preserved in the collection at the SFO Museum, which is astonishing given, like, I don't imagine how many they would have ever made of them, and that they're extremely fragile. They're meant to be, but they've somehow it's survived and is on display, and gives us, again, another glimpse into what we're looking for.
And going back to sort of the artifacts and the debris that was recovered, I'm looking at a newspaper clipping. I believe it's from the San Francisco Examiner, and I wanted to ask you. It does say, Clipper relics here, box recovered near crash scene, and then it goes on to read, in the box are bits of charred wreckage and clothing found floating on the Pacific where the Samoan Clipper plunged into the depths earlier this month. And it was turned over to aeronautical experts of the Department of Commerce for examination of its contents. And a few people as well have asked, is there indication of charring or other, burning of these artifacts that were recovered? And does that, again, affirm this eyewitness account that we have?
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, so those items were recovered on the scene on the day after the accident by the crew of USS Avocet, and collected into only a very small bag. There's actually a photograph that appeared in the New Zealand Herald, um, that shows the bag being carried off of the Avocet after they returned to port on the afternoon of the 12th. And then we have correspondence, between the station manager at Pongo Pongo and the executives at Pan Am headquarters in San Francisco, informing them that he's entrusted the items to the master of, I believe it was a Matson Line steamship that was returning to San Francisco, and that the captain was going to lock them in his safe, and then would turn them over to the Pan Am executives on arrival in San Francisco, which he did, and then that newspaper article then gives us the next link in the chain, that it was turned over to investigators from the Bureau of Air Commerce to assist in the investigation, and then in the report itself, it talks at length about that certain of the items displayed charring or signs of exposure to heat, and in fact the drift tray is said to have been wetted with gasoline and then set on fire, and that some of the items further forward appear to have been exposed to extreme heat but not flame. So it actually was great assistance to the investigators, at the time, to try and piece together, what had happened. But what became of those items after that point? That's where the trail runs cold. For us is with that newspaper article from the Examiner. So yeah, so I'll throw it out to the viewers around the world as well. What happened? What happened to those items after they were given over to the Bureau of Air Commerce? My suspicion, like, we don't have any confirmation one way or another. My suspicion is that they were probably later destroyed or disposed of. Once the investigation was complete. I don't know that they felt the need to retain them, but I could be wrong. That they may have been placed into some kind of storage, um, and so there could still be those traces of this cold case, still in storage somewhere. So
Right, and this is very much a cold case. And you and your team, I mean, have you, other than sort of these documents and archives and historical information, you don't have a lot of hard physical evidence to really go off of. Is that correct?
no, that's I mean, yes, that's correct, but and no, we don't have any hard physical evidence at all. That's what we're here to do now, is to try and locate those traces of that event from 81 years ago, and that's the remarkable thing about the ocean, and it's what what Dr. Ballard likes to call the world's greatest maritime museum, and we're walking around in the halls with a flashlight, trying to find this one particular item, and the amazing thing is that Samoan Clipper should rest where it fell 81 years ago, um, undisturbed. It's a moment frozen in time, and we may be able to jump back into that moment and live it again, or connect it with the present.
And speaking of the present, Dee Dee, do you want to give us a quick update on as to where we are and what we're seeing here?
Sure. We have finished up one of our lines, and we are currently in a turn to our new line. And during a turn, we lose some resolution from the side scan sonar, just the turning of the vessel, the turning of Argus. It sort of messes with the signal a little bit, and that's why it's slightly more wavy and slightly more yellow in the waterfall screen. That's just it's just what happens when you turn. The side scan likes to be at a very constant level and speed, so the turning messes with that a little bit. So once we get back onto the turn, it'll level out, and the resolution and the clarity of that waterfall screen will come back. So we're headed on to one of our next lines and gathering some more data. And we do also record all of the data during these turns, because it's happened many, many times that you find something on the edge of a turn that turns out to be a historical or archaeological resource.
And this area that we're surveying is about 2 square miles, which translates to a little over 5 square kilometers. And we're going about it in a lawnmower pattern. And do you know about how much of it we've covered? I mean, are we a quarter of the way, a half of the way?
I believe we've only covered 1 or 2 lines at this point, so we are at the early stages of our survey block. We have a lot of cable out, so we are going at a pretty slow rate of speed for the ship to keep everything steady. So it's slow going, but that's just the nature of the beast.
And then what sort of things are we looking for? I mean, what sort of indications might be that of an aircraft, and how will that turn up on our side scan sonar, sort of these characteristics that stand out from just being biological features?
So man-made objects typically stand out from the background by having straight lines or right angles, as well as the reflective image that comes back. There's a different return for metal than you would for rock or seafloor. So those are the types of images that we're looking at, and when we see something that looks like a likely candidate as being man-made, we mark that as a target. It's given a number and cataloged, and we will go back and prioritize those targets for further investigation when we're done with the survey area.
And looking at this feed from Argus, you know, you can sort of see the ocean floor. I mean, why isn't that enough? Why do we need to add this sonar?
So the field of view with the Argus camera that you're seeing is pretty small. I think we were talking that it was 20 meters that you could see, where the side scan sonar has a much larger range. You can see out much further on either side of the towfish. That can be changed depending on the type of side scan sonar, the terrain, the vessel, and the speed. So we have it set at 100 meters for the high frequency and 150 meters for the low frequency on either side. So that allows us much greater coverage to see things further out and cover more territory.
And as of now, I think the last time I asked you, you said we've marked 13 potential targets. Is that still the most recent number?
That is correct. We have 13 targets at this point. I'd also like to give a special hello to Dr. Hans von Tilburg, who is joining us in the science chat room. Hello, Hans. Hans is the Pacific Islands Maritime Heritage Coordinator for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. While we are currently not operating within the National Marine Sanctuary of American Samoa, we still are partnering with Hans and the staff there to keep them up to date with our activities, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office, and plan on providing them with the report of our findings to help interpret the story of the Clipper and the larger maritime heritage landscape of American Samoa. So hi, Hans, and thank you a bunch.
And the Nautilus will also be in the National Marine Sanctuary of American Samoa in the coming weeks. So do stay tuned for that. You know.
Part of partnering with the National Marine Sanctuaries is they have a wonderful education and outreach center right downtown in Pongo Pongo, and host a lot of the cruise ship visitors that come into port. So depending on the results of this survey, it's a possibility that there could be some interpretive materials or displays to add to that Discovery and Exploration Center. I think it's the Ocean Science Center, to broaden the reach of the work that we're doing and be able to reach larger audiences.
And this is a unique dive just in the sense that we're only using Argus for this initial phase of the expedition. What benefits do we have in only using Argus as opposed to, you know, the dual ROV system?
So by using Argus, it allows us to take overall survey of the area first, because we can tow that behind us. Whereas Hercules is more of a, if you want to dive into something specific or have more specific area we want to look at. So Argus has a side scanning sonar, as we've been talking about on it. And as we do this lawnmower powering, we're going about 1 knot, towing the vehicle behind us. And we have control over heading, and we can also use the wings to lower and raise the vehicle as the terrain changes.
And we are at a depth of just over 3,000 meters, or about 10,000 feet, which is the altitude where your pilot of an aircraft would say it's safe to recline your chair, bring out the electronics. How far above the seafloor are we operating at?
We are trying to stay between 10 to 15 meters above the seafloor.
Russ, we were talking yesterday just sort of about the number of Sikorsky S-42 flying boats, and there were only a limited number made, and in fact, none of them survived today. Is that what you were telling me?
Yes, that's correct. So there were only ever 10 built, and I believe 5 of them were lost in accidents in service. Simone Clipper was really not very old airplane at the time it was lost. It was delivered in November of 1936, and so barely over a year in service. A couple others were lost in the Caribbean and in landing accidents. So by the end of World War II, come 1946, there were only 5 of them remaining, and by that time, the pace of aeronautical development, especially through the war, was just blindingly fast. I mean, so at the end of World War II, planes had been developed that had much longer range and much more efficient, and the need had been so great to develop airstrips and navigational facilities and everything that land planes now were capable of reaching just about anywhere on the globe. So these big flying boats were really outmoded, and especially ones that were 10 years old or more, in what was where the world was just about to enter the jet age. There was no place any longer, for the S-42s to earn their keep. So most of them were either scrapped, it seems, scrapped, or perhaps scuttled offshore of Miami. And though one of them we know survived for a time, there's a newspaper article from, I believe, from 1947 that talks about a very unusual houseboat that real estate was in great demand in Florida, and I guess somewhat expensive, and some enterprising soul bought a surplus Sikorsky. In fact, the very first one, the Brazilian Clipper, and turned it into a floating houseboat. Shorn of the wings and the tail, but just the center, the hull portion, the boat portion, really, and turned it into a home. Pan Am in its literature described the the clippers as flying yachts. So it's actually not that big of a stretch to go, to turn it into a houseboat. So, and it is a fond, dream of aviation historians that maybe in some Florida backwater somewhere this houseboat is still tucked away somewhere, though I suspect we'd know about it by now. So,
But if you're listening,
yes, if you're listening and you have this strange houseboat that you don't know where it came from, or it looks kind of plainish, plain-like, give us a call or send us an email or what have you.
or
But,
join the chat. You
yes,
can tell us right here.
exactly. But yeah, so the only traces really, and I mean there were two other types of really long-range flying boats that served with Pan American that would have really been considered clippers, and that's the Martin M130 and the Boeing 314, which is really kind of the ultimate expression of that, and what we tend to think of when we picture that kind of golden age of transoceanic travel and the flying clippers. But none of them have survived either. Like all three, there were only three of the Martin M130s built, and they were all lost in accidents. Most famously, Hawaii Clipper, which vanished on a flight to Guam about 6 months after the loss of Samoan Clipper. That was a pretty tough stretch because you lost it, and that was lost with a full load of passengers. So that happens in July of 38. In January of 38, you had lost Samoan Clipper and Ed Musick and his crew, and then in July of 37, Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan, who had been a Pan Am navigator and the navigator on the China Clipper flights and the survey flights with Ed Musick. So that was a very a tough stretch for Pacific flying. But yeah, no traces of that great flying boat era, at least of the Pan Am era, survive today anywhere other than beneath the ocean, and that's what we're hoping to find. There is one. Well, there's a few smaller Sikorskys. They actually made one called the S43, which was dubbed the Baby Clipper, and they used them, more for short-range flights. I think mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, but there was also a military version put out called the JRS-1, and there are three of those that survive, but none of them served with Pan American. So there are two of the military versions. One's at the Pima Air and Space Museum in near Tucson, Arizona. Another one is preserved at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum at their Udvar-Hazy annex at Dulles Airport, and has recently been put on display, and it's a remarkable survivor. It was present at the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and in fact, and it had been used primarily as a mail carrier, and but they sent it out to try and locate the Japanese fleet after the attack. I think probably luckily for that pilot, he did not find them because they wouldn't have had much of a chance with no defensive armament whatsoever. But that's the kind of was the situation, and that's the kind of naval officers that we had then and now that would risk everything to go and try and do their duty. But there's one other survivor of the S43s that's in the collection of a collector by the name of Kermit Weeks at his Fantasy of Flight in Florida, and he was very, very kind to allow me the chance to go and view it, and personally took me back to their storage area and showed me his Baby Clipper that had that he had recently acquired, well, recently in the last few years, but acquired for preservation. And that one had an interesting history too, in that it was initially intended as a long-range ship as well, and was specially commissioned from Sikorsky by Howard Hughes with the intention of flying it around the world. And so it had been modified to carry extra fuel tanks and to make long flights, and remarkably survived to this day. A lot of big flying boats, what ones we have today, survived really because of Howard Hughes, and he was, well, one, quite wealthy and very driven to advance aviation, and as a lot of people probably know, he developed the largest, certainly the largest airplane developed in World War II, the H-1 Hercules, or the Spruce Goose, and in order, the only way to train up to fly the biggest flying boat ever built was to gain experience on a series of other flying boats, and like the S-43, and I think all the way up to a consolidated PB-3Y Coronado, which is a huge U.S. Navy patrol bomber, also from World War II. That the one that he owned is now in the collection of the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida. So they're out there. The flying boats are out there, but unfortunately, none of them that served with Pan Am. The closest that we have is actually at the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, and they have a Sikorsky VS-44, which is the closest analog that we have now to Samoan Clipper and the S-42s. But it's sort of it's the next evolution of the design. It's more streamlined and has an upper deck and but still 4 engines, and a wingspan really only about 6 feet longer than Samoan Clippers, and only a few feet, I think maybe about 10 feet or so longer in the fuselage, and that one had a very, very interesting history, and survived until the 1980s, and then was given to the museum, and they had a group of at that time there were a group of retired Sikorsky employees who had been the ones who had built it in the first place, 40 years earlier, and managed to restore it, back to its original condition. So it is on display there. It served with a company called American Export Lines. But the really neat thing for me was that, in preparing for this project, and I, had wanted to get a look at it and get a sense for, what it was like to be, around and in and on Samoan Clipper, and made contact with the director there, Debbie Reed, and she was very welcoming, immediately was very helpful to the project, and kindly agreed to allow me access to get actually assigned a museum volunteer who also gave of his time to come out and specially bring me inside the airplane and let me look through it, and by a remarkable bit of serendipity, there was a gentleman I was hoping to meet who also lived in Connecticut, who, when he heard where I was going to go, suggested that he would come there and meet me as well, because he'd always wanted to see that museum and see that plane. And that was Ed Tripp, who is the chair of the Pan Am Historical Foundation and the son of Juan Tripp, the founder of Pan American. So that was a real treat for me to get to meet him in that setting, and he is extremely personable and and knowledgeable, and is a accomplished historian and in his own right, and actually was a real driving force in ensuring that the records of Pan American were preserved after the airline ceased operations in 1991. He really led the charge that arranged for them to be preserved at the University of Miami libraries. So, yeah, and he is one of our scientists ashore, and will be able to contribute, as we progress in the investigation. So.
And for those who are listening at home, up on the Nautilus blog, there is a bunch of information, and there's also a few links at the bottom, related resources, and I was just poking through them. One of them is from the Pan Am Historical Foundation, and there are tons of photos of the Samoan Clipper, as well as charts and audio files and a photo of Ed Music. So I do, encourage all of you, if you're interested, to dive a little deeper and explore those resources. And Russ, we are looking for an aircraft, and if we find it, what are we looking specifically that would help us sort of solve this mystery of what happened? I mean, are there certain characteristics that would tell us sort of the events that led up to the accident, and if so, what might those be?
Yeah, if we're, and I'm knocking wood back here, but if we're so fortunate to locate the wreck, in the research design calls for us to first map the area as well as we can, try and plot where the major concentrations of wreckage are, and we'll probably do that continuing to use Argus and continuing to operate the side scan sonar to scan a larger area and get a sense of kind of the lay of the land, before we recover and go through the somewhat lengthy process of reintegrating Hercules. But then once that's done, we can get in and get the really fine detailed work and go in and study it closely. And yes, we'll be, I think primarily, or the priority would be initially to try and conclusively identify the wreck. So we'll be looking for features that are unique to Samoan Clipper, and that would be a lot of that would be painted, like the name was actually painted on the bow, along with the Pan Am winged globe or demi-vol logo. The Pan Am livery, Pan American Airways system, was painted down the upper side of the fuselage. The registration number, NC16734, would be on the upper and lower surfaces of the wing. The wing itself would be painted. Most of the aircraft overall is would be silver, or kind of natural aluminum finish, with the wings actually having this what was called international orange, which was very bright and distinctive color, that would make the plane stand out at if it was force landed at sea. That you could make it out much more easily, and then the registration number painted in black on that, and then also on the tail, painted in black lettering, and the Sikorsky logo. But then there's other structures that would be unique to the S-42, the shape of the cockpit windows, and the side, the big round, kind of portholes almost on the side of the fuselage, and just certain characteristics of how the wing and the fuselage are assembled. So there will be a lot. There are no aircraft of this type, other aircraft of this type, missing in this region. So even if we just find something that is characteristic of an S-42, we know we're on the right spot. And then, yeah, then it's a question of you know, studying the nature of the wreckage and see like what we can deduce from what looks to be, damage from the initial accident, the fire and the explosion, and what might be the result of the aircraft like falling, through the water column and ultimately the impact with the bottom. We're going to be looking for anything that can tell us more about the nature of the fire and the explosion that occurred. A lot of attention was paid at the time at the theory that that it was hot, that the gasoline had somehow made contact with the hot exhaust of the engines. Apparently, the fuel dump valves were flush with the undersurface of the wing and in close proximity to the engines, and that they determined later that the vortices created by the wind rushing over the wings would have a tendency to cause the fuel to flow back and forward into the wing spaces and close to the engines, and so there was a supposition that maybe that had set off the chain of events that destroyed the plane. So say we look and find charring on the wing surface, then maybe that tells us that the fire did indeed begin there or was ignited there. We might want to get a look as well at the number 4 engine, which would be the right outboard engine, which was the one that was shut down, that necessitated their return to Pongo Pongo in the first place. There are other potential sources of ignition. Static charge. They had shut down the radio, so that's not likely. Another theory was that the electric flap actuators may have caused a spark and ignited a fuel that was backing into the wings. I find it interesting that the Bureau of Air Commerce report talks about fire underneath the flooring of the auxiliary fuel compartment, and one of the items that we received from the research that was done on our behalf at the Sikorsky Historical Archives, initially by John Bulakowski and also followed up by Dan Libertino, the chief archivist. But they found a really great document. It's one of the few ones that survives that's particular to the S-42B, but it is a fuel system diagram. It's kind of head-on cutaway view that shows the placement of the fuel tanks and makes it clear that the hull tanks could not be drained directly. You couldn't vent them. You couldn't dump them directly. You had to rely on the existing dump system that was in the standard plane, and the standard plane carried its fuel all in the wing, and so the dumps were just gravity fed, just flush openings, that were spring loaded. You'd pull a lever, and it would open this valve and just allow the fuel to drain away. So in order to drain the hull tanks, you first needed to pump that fuel up into the wing tanks before it went overboard. So since we know that the plane was dumping fuel, it's reasonable to think that they would have been also engaged in pumping those tanks dry. And if you look at that document that we got from the Sikorsky Archives, it shows that there is underneath the floor of the cabin, there is a fuel pump with both a manual and an electric setting. And so I'm interested in that. I don't know that what evidence would survive if that really was indeed the ignition point. Like, would the mechanism or any trace of it really survive? But you imagine that it was in what amounts to essentially the bilge, because this is a flying boat. So if there's any kind of leak from the hull tanks and the fuel is collecting in the bilge, and fuel vapors are building up in the area, the enclosed space beneath the flooring and and you have this unshielded electric motor, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's so it's just another theory, but it's one that maybe we can investigate if we come across the wreckage. And one other thing we've done is, again, we have a group of scientists ashore, as they're known, and who are able to coordinate with our science team here, and they're people with specialized knowledge in this, and people who know vintage aircraft structures and historians, and we're very fortunate to recruit Mark Smith, who is now retired, but spent a 35-year career investigating aircraft accidents for Boeing. And so he has agreed to be another set of eyes for us, so that I saw that he was logged in to the science chat a little earlier and was monitoring what was happening, and he'll be checking in, and we can also send him an alert if we get on the site, and we'll have his expertise and his knowledge backing us up as we conduct this new investigation.
Retirement is relative, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so, we talked a little bit earlier about the harbor at Pongo Pongo, and I'm reading the accident report filed by the Bureau of Air Commerce on April 1st of 1938, so just shy of 4 months after the accident. And it does, describe that harbor, and it says that it's necessary to describe the harbor in order to explain why a landing wasn't immediately able by the crew, and that's because, Pongo Pongo Harbor is, like you mentioned, this boot-shaped water area with a very narrow entrance to the sea, and is surrounded by hills, abrupt hills even, right at the water's edge, to a height of between 500 and 1,700 feet. And, we were there, we saw sort of this dramatic landscape that the Samoan Clipper would have had to come over and then sort of dive dramatically to make that landing. And, this is why the Samoan Clipper was employed in the first place, right? To sort of reach these hard to reach areas that didn't necessarily have landing strips.
Oh yeah. I mean, the decision to use flying boats was very much determined by that, by the lack of developed landing fields that really didn't come into use widely until during and after World War II. So if you were wanting to start this this transoceanic service, the best facilities existed in port cities, so to service maritime traffic. But so you could kind of piggyback on that. And your airplane, basically, as long as you're flying over water, your airplane is taking its landing field with it everywhere it goes. So you're conceivably you have an emergency landing area, beneath you at all times. But it is not ideal. Like, it is still extremely dangerous to try and land a flying boat at sea, and in any kind of swell and waves, and especially one that is heavily loaded and underpowered. So a lot of people might question Music's judgment in electing to dump fuel rather than just landing as he was, like either at sea or in the harbor. But there was a great deal of risk involved in any of those choices, and he relied on his own experience to know that in his judgment, the best course of action was to try and lighten the plane, because it was more certain, in his mind, that there would be a problem in trying to set down in that very restricted space, or in the swells of the ocean itself. And I mean, the fact that so many of these planes were ultimately lost in landing accidents, kind of bears that out. There was one that was lost to an in-flight fire and explosion, one of the Sikorsky S-42s anyway, and the rest, in landing accidents. So in that sense, he was right in that the odds, seemed to favor, taking action to lighten the plane, but of course in this instance it did work against them. But yes, and as you say, the Bureau of Air Commerce report makes a point in that you need to first understand the nature of that harbor to then process like what steps he was taking and why he took them, and the need to try and lighten that airplane first before making that landing approach. And I don't know if we have it up on the website. Maybe we can, but later if we don't. But author John Krupnick, who wrote Pacific Pioneers, which is an exhaustive and thorough. Well, I should more say thorough, but history of the Pan Am Pacific Division, and just a fascinating book to read. And he has collected a number of photographs that he shared with us, and one of them actually depicts one of those previous landings where you see the Samoan Clipper just diving for the water, just below the ridge line, headed for landing at the harbor in Pongo Pongo. And it was really something for me to board Nautilus for the first time in the harbor there, and go up towards the bow, and I looked out over the bow, and we were lined up right with that ridge, and you could see it right there, and that the plane would have landed, right alongside where we were tied up.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. You pulled out the photo of the Samoan Clipper descending down to make its landing, and we were looking at that same ridge, and you could see, it's virtually unchanged, really, which is incredible. And again, I'm looking at this accident report, and a few folks have asked what weather conditions were on that day, and it says skies were clear, wind was calm. It was 79 degrees Fahrenheit with smooth water conditions. And so, that, given that information along with the eyewitness statement and sort of the investigation following the accident, it's pretty safe to assume that it was error with the aircraft. Would you say?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was I was reading some input from the chat, so I missed the question.
Oh yeah, no worries. I was just saying, based on sort of the weather conditions and the eyewitness statements, it's pretty safe to assume that it was something that went wrong with the aircraft that resulted in the accident.
Yeah, I mean, we would not describe it as pilot error. Everyone at the time and today would say that Music's judgment was right on, and the report makes it clear that they were, the crew were all in good health, and the airplane had been checked, very thoroughly. But so, and it's hard to say. I mean, I don't think it was it was an accident, but one that's probably inherent to the fact that this was a modified design or a modified aircraft, and that was had been specially outfitted for long distance flying. So it had features that weren't common to the production version of this plane. And I think when you make those kinds of changes, the chance for problem, for accidents, kind of creeps in, and so and also and it's, some of these things are just things that are learned through hard-earned experience, and sometimes it come at great cost. So one of the interesting things, I mentioned the VS-44, the flying boat that's at the New England Air Museum, and I asked when we were there and they were showing us around, I asked our guide, our museum volunteer, to show me the dump valves, because I wanted to compare that and to see like how does that relate to Samoan Clipper, and it doesn't at all, because they learned that lesson. So when he showed me the dump valve, the outlet is actually all the way in the tail of the airplane. They do not drain individually from flush underneath the wing, but all of them are ducted into